And thanks everyone for tuning in today. Let's go ahead and get started, if you guys don't mind. Hello, and welcome to Exile and Bookbill's Author on Tap reading series. If this is all new to you, I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, co-run Exile and Bookbill, an online bookshop that is slowly inching its way to a real live bookstore status by the minute. We will be selling books in vinyl in person in a physical space by the end of summer somewhere here in Chicago. We are so very lucky to have with us on the show tonight, Raymond Antrobus. Raymond was born in London to an English mother and Jamaican father. He was awarded the 2017 Geoffrey Dearmer Prize, judged by Ocean Vuong, as well as the 2019 Sunday Times University of Warwick Young Writer of the Year Award. The Perseverance is his debut poetry collection, and if you've read any portion of it, you'll not be surprised that it won the Ted Hughes Award for New Work in Poetry in 2019. His second full-length book of poems, All the Names Given, is forthcoming from Tin House in 2021. He is currently based between London and Oklahoma City. Raymond will be in conversation with Maryse Meijer, who, aside from being one of my favorite humans in the multiverse, is the author of the short story collections Heartbreaker and Rag, as well as Northwood and her most recent novel, The Seventh Mansion. She lives here in Chicago with her lovely family. This event will have live closed captioning, and McClindon and Bree Jones will interpret ASL. Thanks you two for being here tonight, and thanks Tin House for providing that option for us. Tonight is a milestone of sorts for Exile, as this is our very first poetry event ever. And we couldn't be happier to have Raymond and Maryse here tonight to present this to us. You can purchase books from tonight's event through links in the chat, and each book will come with a signed book plate. You all that are tuning in tonight, feel free to keep your camera on, but please mute yourself. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Maryse will be happy to get them to Raymond towards the end of the show. I'm going to pass this along to Maryse now. Enjoy the show, you guys. Have a good show. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you so much to Exile and Bookbill for hosting this event and for inviting me to be a part of it. I had read Raymond's poetry when I first found this chapbook, To Sweet and Bitter. And when I was invited to speak about the Perseverance, I was like literally screamed. So it's a great honor and a pleasure to meet Raymond tonight and to hear and see him read. So I think we're going to do the reading first, if that's okay, Raymond. We'll get like maybe 10 minutes of poems. And I wanted to let everyone know who's watching, please feel free while you're listening and watching the poetry being performed, take some notes, write down your thoughts, your impressions, your feelings. Sometimes questions for events are focused on details about writers' lives or the background of poems, and sometimes we feel a little bit shy or unable to speak about the work itself. And with poetry, it's a great opportunity to talk about the work, because when we're reading fiction and novels and short stories, we're only getting a glimpse, and it's harder to really speak to the larger context of the work. But with the great thing about poetry is that you get the whole thing there. So don't feel shy about your feelings of maybe intimidation about poetry or your interpretation, or maybe feeling like a question you might have is stupid or uninformed. Please feel free to speak to the poems, let them speak to you, and include your questions or your comments about them. I would love to hear what everyone has to say. And with that, I'll turn it over to Raymond.
Thank you, Maryse. Great to be here. Let's just go straight into the poems. So the book is called The Perseverance. This is my first full-length poetry collection. And it begins with the first poem. The first is a sequence, actually. So it's 5 sections to make up a single poem. And that poem is called Echo. And the way in which it kind of opens out is, I guess, something that's kind of unsaid, talking about, the context and the story underneath a poem. I lost my dad about 5 years ago, and we were pretty close, and I found myself needing to go somewhere where I hadn't really, been before. And so I ended up going to Barcelona, and on my own, and I just kind of needed to get out of my head. I went into Gaudi's cathedral, and I took the audio guide while I was there. And if you take the audio guide, the way it works is that it directs you towards different parts of the cathedral, and then you press a button and it tells you a certain history about the way that particular part of the cathedral was built. It was kind of like a lifelong project of Gaudi's to make this cathedral. And the audio guide speaks so much about the acoustics, about sounds, and there's one particular part where it asked you to look up into a certain unorthodox shape of a roof and shout or sing, and just be vigilant of how the sound moves in this space, because it was believed that it was a holy container of sound. So the way you would experience sound in this place would be how angels experience it. And so I was having that experience artificially because I'm deaf, so I wear hearing aids. The audio guide was synced up to all this Bluetooth technology. And I was wondering, well, are deaf people included in this idea of holy sound and the elevation of sound? So that was kind of the question which began the book, while I'm kind of in these early stages of mourning, in a way, of losing my dad. I'm also the grandson of a preacher, so that kind of comes into it slightly. Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness was a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What language would we speak without ears? What? Is paradise a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudge green label reads, Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrobus, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrobus. 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 And if you don't catch nothing, there's something wrong with your ears. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family, but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing until the doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the test, I still held enough bricks in my hand I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it my sanctuary. Call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons where he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes. So I think I'm going to read a poem which appears in the middle of the book, which is the title poem, The Perseverance. So many people may be wondering why the book is called Perseverance, and there are multiple reasons for that. But one of the most, I suppose, literal reasons is it's the name of the pub my dad used to drink in when I was a kid. And I grew up in Hackney in East London. It's, historically one of the poorest areas of London. And in the past, 10, 15 years or so, it's become one of the most heavily gentrified. So if you go to the pub where the Perseverance is, it's pretty much the only establishment that survived gentrification. So it just kind of sings poetry to me, with that being a fact, that the one I guess, establishment to survive gentrification on this street is called the Perseverance. And in a way, thinking about that as a poet, and the word, the perseverance, is a kind of, it's frozen. It's a frozen poem, it's part of a landscape. It's a poem in a landscape to me every time I walk past the pub. And so when I was a kid, my dad was struggling with alcohol. He was alcoholic, and he would leave me outside this pub quite a lot. So I had quite a few memories of just standing outside this pub and waiting for my dad to come back. And one other thing to say about this poem is it begins with an epigraph which says, "Love is the man overstanding." And overstanding is a Jamaican colloquial saying, and it just means, go beyond understanding. I don't understand, I overstand. And that kind of twine that Jamaicans have of just remixing language. The Perseverance, love is the man overstanding. I wait outside the Perseverance, just popping in here a minute. I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father, watch him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the Perseverance until everything disappears. I'm outside, counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We've been here before. No such thing as too much laughter, unless you're my mother without my father, working weekends while the Perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the Perseverance where strangers ask, "Where is your father?" I stare at the doors and say, my father is working. Strangers who don't disappear, but hug me for my Perseverance. Dad said, this will be the last time before. While the TV spilled a can of laughter, us on the sofa in his council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil. Any minute I will eat again with my father, who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before overstanding our heat and Perseverance. I still hear popping in for a minute, see him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it, and I am still outside the Perseverance, listening for the laughter. I'm going to read a poem which is a bit further on. This poem is called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. Daniel Harris is a man who lost his life a number of years ago, and I happened to be in New York when I heard this story. I should say I went to a deaf school in London growing up as part of a deaf school and a hearing school. So I started learning some British Sign Language when I was 11 years old. And then coming to America and trying to kind of connect with deaf people in the States as well, and seeing how completely different BSL and ASL are. There's almost, they're completely different languages, and why wouldn't they be when you think about it? When you think about a language as a very kind of site-specific thing with its own history and its own context. So in a way, I try and learn and pick up bits of ASL when I'm here, when I'm in the States. And on this particular day, when I read about what happened to Daniel Harris, the word I picked up in ASL was alive. And I deliberately changed a little bit of the shape of the sign for the purposes of the poem. So for example, like live or alive is just on one hand in British Sign Language, live. And it's also a sign to be careful with because it's also very close to toilet. So toilet, live. It's a funny one. Anyway, so Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. When Daniel Harris stepped out of his car, the police officer was waiting, gun raised. I used the past tense, so this is irrelevant in Daniel's language, which is sign. Sign has no future or past tense, it is a present language. You are never more present than when a gun is pointed at you. What language says this if not sign? But the police officer saw hands waving in the air, fired, and Daniel dropped his hands, his chest bleeding out to the concrete meters from his home. And I'm in New York coffee house reading this news on my phone when a black policewoman walks in, 2 guns on her hips, my friend next to me reading the comic section, Black Lives Matter. Now what could we sign or say out loud when the last word I learned in American Sign Language was alive, alive, both thumbs pointing at your lower abdominal, index fingers pointing up like 2 guns in the sky. Cool. Shout out to Matt. So I'm just going to read 2 more poems, I think. Is that okay? Or shall we go into the discussion? Yeah, just 2 more. Okay, I'm just going to read quickly the Ted Hughes poem, which is called Death School after Ted Hughes, and it appears in the book as this, as a redacted poem. It goes on for 2 pages. And basically, the context to this is Ted Hughes in the early 80s. Oh, if you don't know who Ted Hughes is, he's like a very famous, esteemed English poet. The former husband, oh, there you go. Yes, the former husband of Sylvia Plath. That story doesn't end well. Terrible story. But anyway, yeah, that's a whole other discussion. But coming through the English education system, it's hard not to know who Ted Hughes is. Anyway, I'd come across this poem in which Ted Hughes had written about deaf students, deaf young people. And the reason he did that was because he was commissioned to figure out how people live without language. And so he took it upon himself to visit a deaf school in London with the premise that deaf people don't have language. And you're seeing the deaf language or some deaf language in front of you right now. So we already know the false premise in which Ted Hughes approached this poem. So he sits in this classroom and he writes about these deaf children. And I'm just going to read, I suppose, some of the images that Ted Hughes uses to describe these children. He says, we're unaware, simple pool, lacking a dimension, removed from the vibration of air, alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. So with coming across this poem, I decided to revise the text and use some of the images that Ted used about these children and just direct it back to him. I also decided that I had to, meet Ted Hughes at his own game. Ted Hughes loves the extended nature-based metaphor. So I happened to be in New Orleans when I came across this poem. So I looked at the Mississippi River and literally wrote it while I was sitting by the river to speak back to Ted Hughes. So this poem is called After Reading Death School by the Mississippi River. No one wise calls the river unaware or simple pools. No one wise says it lacks a dimension. No one wise says its body is removed from the vibration of air. The river is a quiet breath taker, gargling mud. Ted is alert and simple. Ted lacked a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. Ted lived through his eyes, but eyed the colossal currents from the bridge, eyed riverboats ghosting a geography of fog. Mississippi means big river, named by French colonizers. The natives laughed at their arrogant maps, conquering wind and marking mist. The mouth of the river laughs. A man in a wetsuit emerges, pulls misty goggles over his head. Couldn't see a thing. He breathes heavily. My face was in darkness. No one heard him. The river drowned him out. So the last poem I'm going to read is the last poem in the book. And the question that this last poem was, I guess the question I was asking myself as I wrote this poem was, where does language begin for me? And that was a question which was very much based in a very kind of concrete way, rather than that kind of philosophical interior way that, you know, we go with poets. I really wanted to think, where did language, or where did the English language begin for me? And some of the earliest memories I have are being read to by my dad. And this book, I would ask him to read me every night. It's called Happy Birthday Moon. It's a children's picture book. And it tells the story about a bear that lives out in the forest. And on this one particular night, the bear stands on a hill, looks out over the woods and the river and the lakes, and looks up at the full yellow moon in a starry sky. And the bear says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes through the valley, and he hears his own voice again, "It's my birthday." And then the bear says, "Wow, it's the moon's birthday as well." So that sets up this great poetic, I'm going to call it a deaf poetic device, because it's about repetition. And when you're deaf in the hearing world, you know, you're asking people to repeat a lot. So this particular story was what I would ask my dad to read me, and he would do this thing when he would come across, I don't know if any of your parents did this, but when there was a blank page, he would run his finger along a blank page and kind of make up something. So he gave himself the space to invent his own scenes. So every time I read this story, it was actually a different story, and that's quietly referenced in this poem. So I invite you, listeners, readers, poetry lovers, poetry curious investigators, to, you know, ask yourselves that question, you know, where did language begin for you? And I hope that this is a poem that invites that. Thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to speaking with Maryse and some of you after this. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words, tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words, tracing white space. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, "Try again." Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, "Raynan Akabok." He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, "Try again." But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, "Raynan Akabok." He laughs, says, "Raymond, yes, something else." I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. "Raynan Akabok, what else will help us?" He says, "Raymond, You're something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Rain and Akabok. What else will help us hear each other? Really hear each other. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night, and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, what a pleasure to hear you read and to watch the interpreters. Oh, it's good. It's good stuff. So,
Appreciate you, Bree. Sorry, thank you.
it's already 7:27. I have 2 single-space pages of comments. Let's dig right in. And I thought that I would start at the back of your book. And maybe we can move our way from this general to the specific of the poems. But one thing that struck me about the book was the notes, the length notes that you have, and how long your acknowledgements is.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's like 100 people. I want people to see it. It's just like this huge list of names of people that Raymond thanked, and at the end it says, "I am me because you are you." And one of the things that struck me about this book, and to Sweet and Bitter as well, was the sense of the poems speaking not from a single poet identity, right? Speaking only about your experiences and only about yourself, but the enormous sense of community that is in these poems and in this book as a whole. So there's so many poems about, trying to speak to the past, to deaf figure past, the deaf figures in your life, to your family, to friends, all of that. And then even as you were describing the poems before you read them, you're giving us all this context for the inspiration for the poems. In the extensive notes, there's names for the forms of the poems, which I love because of course I can see the patterns, but I don't know the names for all the forms in poetry. And you said when you were reading the moon, the Happy Birthday Moon, you asked us to think about, where did language begin for you? And this question of community for me is one that I think about all the time in my own work and in my life, because I'm an identical twin. And so for me, the I already includes the we. There is, like, I don't understand the liberal notion of the self being isolated, selfish alone, because I don't experience the world in that way ever. And I can't imagine what it's like to experience the world in that way. So I just thought it was lovely that the poems were not just given to us in a vacuum and said, here, you apply your own knowledge or your intelligence of interpretation, and that's it. That the sense is that the poems are not only haunted by these other figures, but these other figures are present in the work. So they're not just references. They're not devices. They're real people who, whether they're dead or alive, or people that you know, or strangers, that are truly present in the text. And so I wanted to say thank you for that. It contributes to my feeling as a reader that I'm also included in the text as a listener, as an observer, but that I'm part of this polyphony of voices. So I was curious about how you think about this question of community in your work, and why use poetry to speak to and about and for others?
Yeah, oh, that's such a rich question, which, we could probably write a book just on that one question.
Yeah, I wrote a lot of notes about it. This is like, there's so much.
So I will say that I am interested in the idea of community. It's something that I try to make part of my practice, developing community. And I'm talking about, creative community, writing community, teachers community. and I'm, yeah, I'm not, the whole idea is that, you're acknowledging, or I feel like I'm acknowledging that I'm not inventing the wheel here. I'm trying to keep a conversation going. And there are multiple conversations that are happening throughout the perseverance. One is, like you say, one of language, the other one, and within language, you've got the signed language, the spoken language, the written language. And then you've got this other kind of idea of family, which comes through the book, and then the other idea of education. So these are quite, broad, abstract words which mean different things to different people. So the idea with the kind of notes and the acknowledgements, and kind of, in some cases, I'm summoning people, acknowledging people who didn't even ask to be acknowledged, but people who I feel impacted enough of my journey, because writing is not easy. This is a tough thing. We need, I should speak for myself and say I've needed constant encouragement at times when I've just felt, what's the point of this? Who's listening? What new is there to say anyway? But I feel very affirmed by the idea that I have company in literature, right? Writing, I think this idea that writing has to be this solitary thing. If you think about the stereotype of the poet, like Rilke, who locked themselves in this cathedral for 9 years and try to immerse themselves in such intense solitude and loneliness because that's the only way to create great poetry. I don't subscribe to that. I love Rilke. But I don't subscribe to his methods. And I don't feel like I'm trying to hide anything. I think I'm trying to show or give back the kind of generosity that was given to me as a student, as a poet, as a son, as a brother. All of these different kind of things. It's important to me. It's how I'm trying to move through the world. So bringing that into my work. I like that you said this as well, because the next book, I had the same thing. I got to the contents page and I got to the acknowledgements and the notes section, and I was like, do I need, I almost questioned it. I don't know. I decided to do it again. I've got another, equally long acknowledgements and notes in the next book as well, because I'm just like, no, I want to be very intentional with who this book is for and how it moves through the world and who it speaks to and with and where it speaks from. I do want some intention to show that I'm intentional in that. And I do also see, like, I have actually got some criticism for that. Readers who prefer not being told too much context and, like you say, like kind of filled in their own kind of world to it. And that's fine too. I've got nothing against that. But like I said, I felt that these books was both of this book and the book that's coming, they're both so just personal that I wanted to say very clearly what I was trying to do and who I'm trying to bring in to the conversation.
Yeah, I agree that the Rilkean, if that's a word, image of the poet is sort of even more than the other arts, even more than painting or writing fiction or writing music. For a long time, poetry has been seen as the highest form of speech. And even though its history as, pre-text was for the people, right? It's a way to preserve stories and to keep them alive and to keep information alive and culture alive. But now we have the sense of it that it's reserved for, only the highest crust of listeners, and you can only have this very educated reader. And so I was wondering how, and I wanted to say that I wrote a book that looks like poetry, and originally I had wanted to call it poetry and to see if I could be a poet. And I got scared because I felt like I wasn't smart enough, or I didn't know how, I guess. And so I backed out at the last minute, and I was like, it's just a book, it's fiction, it's a novel. And so I wondered how you were able to, did you ever feel that barrier to poetry, or to like a sense of hesitation to call yourself a poet, and to allow yourself that way of communicating? Or did it just seem like, no, poetry is mine, and it's ours?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that one of my biggest privileges is being born to two parents who loved poetry. So poetry was part of my upbringing. So like I said about the book Happy Birthday Moon, there's poetry in that book, and it was this fun experience. My mum put a William Blake poem on my wall when I was a kid, London, one of Blake's famous poems. My dad he put a poem on the wall called the Banana Man's Song, and it's a persona poem told from the perspective of a Jamaican farmer in the rural land, and it has this refrain in it. So my dad would sing it to me. Praise God in this big right hand, I would live and I'd die a banana man. And then it goes in to kind of chart the history of the land and the plowing of a land in a way that, to me, I don't separate a poem like that, which is again one meant for I suppose the voice and the performance, but I don't separate that from, say, like Seamus Heaney talking about potatoes in Ireland. Like there's so I would say that I am. When I think of poetry, I think of my family. I think of the stories I was told. I think of the people who read to me and introduced me to literature. I don't think of my learning Shakespeare sonnets in English by a teacher who's terrified of poetry and has no real connection with it and has to do it because it's part of the job. I'm not saying that, that some people didn't get that experience, but that seems to be quite typical. And that seems to be a lot of people's barriers with poetry because of the way it's assessed. One of my favorite definitions of poetry and the clearest that I've heard came from Terence Hayes, the American poet from Pittsburgh. And he said, poetry is figurative language with a sound and a shape. It's just clean. It's not trying to do or be anything other than that. So I do consciously make that part of my practice as a poet to bring more people in. I want, again, what kind of links to my philosophy of the acknowledgements and the notes and the people I'm trying to bring into the conversation as well. So, I acknowledge that I'm just so kind of privileged to have had that. And so I also find that there are lots of different ideas that people have of, what poetry is, for example. So, like I said about my mom, William Blake, she also kind of gave me this very concrete thing, because William Blake wrote about London. Very specifically, he wrote about Peckham in southeast London. And she would take me to the places that appeared in his poem. And she's like, oh, the Peckham Rye, this is where Blake saw an angel. It's like, oh, wow. So it was literal, a very literal thing for me that poetry was a place I existed inside of. But again, I acknowledge that as a great privilege of mine to have these, in the educational language, we would call that culture capital, right? I'm just rich in culture capital for that. And then my dad, he loved lots of Jamaican poets, Miss Lou, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Jean Binta Breeze, Muta Baruka, these poets who would sometimes appear on the radio and he'd record them. The tattoo I have on my arm of a tape is of my dad's tape, which he would record lots of poems for TV on, and then he would play them to me. And then I found the tape when he passed away, and I was just listening to these poems. This Miss Lou poem, what a devilment in England, and waged war and cursed the worst, but then wondering how them going to stand colonization in reverse. So like these kind of, again, these very kind of Jamaican folklore poems. And then suddenly on this tape, I hear my voice. My dad was recording my voice alongside the recital of these poems. So, you know, I think that not that I was kind of groomed in any way to be a poet. I don't think my parents wanted me to be a poet because we don't get paid. So for a long time, I just had to be like, no, I'm a teacher. I'm just doing teaching. But yeah.
So yeah, you had parents who had an ear for it and saw the beauty in it and the value. That's so beautiful. I thank them in your stead. Oh gosh, we're just running out of time. I encourage people at this point to submit questions. I haven't had a chance to look, so we'll be getting to those in a few minutes. But my last question, I wanted to ask about the role of silence in your work. And of course, you know, that's a term and an idea that so many people associate with deafness and deaf culture. That I was rereading Oliver Sacks's Seeing Voices.
Oh, yeah. Great, yeah.
It's such a compassionate and beautiful book. But this time around, I was struck by how often Sacks, even coming from this place of generosity and understanding, harps on this notion that without certain kinds of communication, humans are not fully human, right? He just invokes that over and over in so many ways, and that language and speech make us fully human. And I totally get where he's coming from with that, but it's sort of like the Ted Hughes poem where there's this assumption, if you don't speak how I speak, then you're not speaking. And how that relates to David Abram's notion in his book Spell of the Sensuous of human speech, all human speech, eradicating the rest of the language of the natural world. And that once language comes on the scene in human history, the natural world falls silent. And then reading the Sacks and thinking about the assumption of silence, and we're from the outside looking in, just like Ted Hughes watching those kids at the school and assuming that there's nothing inside there, you know, just because he can't understand how they're communicating. And so the assumption is that it's deficient, that these people are, you know, poor in world. Danielle, my twin, tell me which philosopher says that. I love that phrase, poor in world. And so I was thinking about, you know, how writing and all these other forms of speech making and communication, you know, resist this in many ways, with people telling their own stories and speaking on behalf of people who haven't been allowed to speak or that we don't hear, because they are speaking, but we're just not listening maybe. But what happens with the things that are still unsayable? And if you have a sense that there is truth in that, like, is silence still necessary, number one? And are there reasons why silence is still imposed upon different people and on writing itself, that we can kind of remove those barriers, that we can allow for more speech? Did that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring in, you know, the kind of ongoing conversation a lot of deaf poets have been having for a while around silence, you know, which is this idea of, you know, silence is the invention of the hearing, right? You know, Ilya Kaminsky has said that, McDay has said that, I've had various other deaf poets have said that. So within that mentality, we're still kind of being framed or seen on the terms of the hearing world and the hearing understanding. And it's not, you know, we've got this culture, but, you know, it's the whole thing of the Enlightenment era, which is where that comes from. You know, that whole idea of that was the conclusion of 100 years of philosophy to that question, what makes us human? Conclusion, language, right? So I mean, it is interesting that our culture very much hasn't yet figured out how to speak or complicate that idea. And you're right, like, you know, whiteness is entwined in that, and colonialism is entwined in that. So it's a sociological question, right? How to undo it, I don't know, but I suppose this is why I turned to poetry, and why, for me, in my mind, poetry was the best or the most appropriate medium for me to approach that, in the sense of, if I can find a way on the page, using the English language and illustrated sign language and these other kind of techniques of like erasures or showing other dimensions to ideas of language that go inside or outside, or just other ways to look at an idea, other ways to, I'm going to call it a kind of fuckery, like mash up a language. Like there's lots of that kind of thing. And, you know, I think like my dad was a Rastafarian, and so much of it, the language of a lot of Rastafarians is about kind of a mix up or a deconstruction of language. So, for example, like the word politrick, you know, it's never politic, it's politrick, you know. So there's kind of a, I loved hearing that and being exposed to that, because it went in the face of any idea of purity, right? I mean, the Rastafarian religion in and of itself is some kind of remixed, bastardized, like some Buddhism is in there, some Christianity is in there, some Hinduism is in there. It's a total kind of very, very complicated kind of way of being. So, and this is everywhere. The more you look at a thing, the more you're like, this is crazy that this even exists. But going back to your idea of silence, I don't know. I mean, poetry, like I showed you how my dad would read me a complete blank page, and this could be looked at as silence. This is silence personified, but my dad still found a way to make some kind of noise with it, create something from it.
And then it changed every time.
Right, exactly.
You know? And that's the beauty of it, is that there's nothing written down. And so maybe that emphasis on like, just what you say about the Enlightenment, like, let's just get, you know, science can solve everything, humans can figure everything out, all we have to do is just contain all the knowledge and write it down in stone, and then we're done, like, with figuring out what it means to be alive and what it means to be a person.
You got it.
I love that image in the poem of just the finger just keeps going. And that's what you try to, I mean, when you have a child too, that's Oliver Sacks talks about how, you know, it's the mother, of course, with all due respect to Sacks, whose book was written a while ago, so there's still some gender stuff in there, but that children, that it's the mother who gives language to the child, and that it's a dialogue, and that if she's not presenting language, and the child won't have it. And of course. And when you're doing that, when you're reading to a child, and you can do that in so many ways, by stopping and saying, well, what do you think happens next? Or how would you change it? Or like, there's all these invitations to imagine a different world than the one that is written. So that even with words, like, you need that white space, number one, of course, to make sense of language at all, but you also need the silence that makes the space for other people to speak. And so that it's not a void, it's not an abyss, but it's actually this, you know, a necessary, generative, you know, positive space, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I love that.
All right, we solved it. We did it. Let's look at the questions. Here. Oh, yes, thank you, Peter. Heidegger was the, he who must not be named was the philosopher who had this idea of animals being poor in world. And that's why animals are, one of the reasons why animals are inferior to humans, partly because they don't have language. They can't denote. Which is bullshit, but okay.
Yeah, get it.
All right. And Peter goes on to say, thanks so much for this. I noticed that there is a theme of high-low that was running throughout a lot of the recited work. The angels up in the rafters, the sounds under the sea, over understanding, thumbs pointing down at the body, fingers pointing up at the sky. Even the bear down on the earth, thinking he hears the moon in the heavens. I wonder if the theme of volume is at work here. Maybe the sense that a hearing culture demands the volume up and deaf culture thrives with the volume down. I like that. Or perhaps that is clumsily stated and should be something that focuses more on the obsession that hearing culture has with volume in the first place. Along the same lines, I also wondered if Raymond sees a connection or a closeness to the divine in deaf languages, since God is said to speak to us, but we hear it in our heads, and clearly this is a sort of hearing for which we don't need ears. Same perhaps for angels. We pray and speak and are spoken to by the divine inside without the need for hearing. The holy language is thus a silent, unspoken, unheard language. The realm of the sacred might be in fact a noiseless palace, and this beautiful poetry welcomes us into its halls and rooms. Thank you, Raymond, Maryse, and Javier, and the interpreters.
Great. Cool. That's the beginning of a dissertation right there.
Peter's a philosopher. He's my brother-in-law, so yeah. But I love this idea of volume and shape, which was another thing I had written down in the notes to address. Didn't have time, but yeah, what any of that would you?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I got to say to that. Like, I'm glad that people can kind of create that kind of space through the work, you know. Everything that was said there sounds true, you know, and especially the whole idea of the you know, contrast. Yeah, the high, the low, but also the in, the out, also the land, the sea. So there's like there's a lot of water in the book as well, and water has this very kind of gray. It's a gray thing. And by gray, I don't mean neutral. I just mean complicated. Like, so I don't, yeah. I'm just gonna say.
I just read a book, speaking of water as a gray place, and then how sound works in water. I read a novel by Joni Murphy called Talking Animals that came out last fall, I think. And it's about, I mean, the animals are the people, but they're, you know, us. But there's this beautiful and really horrifying moment in the text where she's describing how loud it is now under the water because of all the human sonar stuff and military actions, and you know, it's just how sound moves through water, and so many sea creatures rely on being able to communicate with sound, and that there is no space of silence anymore in the ocean because our sounds are dominating. And I remember just crying and just being like, why are we so loud all the time? So Peter, your comment about the obsession with the volume up, like in human culture, and how that, I mean, it's literally destroying the planet. And destroying ourselves too, not just the non-human, but it's we're hurting ourselves because we can't listen, we can't hear, and there's not enough space to hear. And hopefully poetry can do something about that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, this is it, like the kind of intersection of all of these kind of I suppose you could call it these injustices, and the kind of work in which poetry, you know, what can poetry do about that? If that's a question, then it's like, it's an as relevant question to ask, well, what does language do?
What does it do? Yeah.
the way we understand the world, where we're at right now, right? So I know I've been, leaning a lot into poets who are out there as eco-justice poets, and that idea. And yeah, and when I read that poetry and the philosophy of those poets, I see no real kind of separation from a poet writing about colonialism or in my case, of course, kind of injustices within the education system. They're all linked. I'm just interested that Derrida,
Mhm.
the philosopher, has come up a lot. Is there like a thing, since I've been in America, this philosopher keeps coming up, and I'm like, is this a thing? Is Derrida having a moment? Is there like a Derrida trend right now? Because it's like the 5th time in the past few weeks. Even at the poems I've been reading, I'm like, oh look, Derrida.
That's funny because I mean, he's a French philosopher, and I feel like all of that stuff, was like so popular and dominated philosophy and cultural criticism for so many years. And I kind of, my feeling is that it's on the going down. It's interesting that, that seems like a American obsession or phenomenon. I mean, it's an easy way to talk about certain ideas that have a kind of cachet and that, make us sound smart. So maybe that's part of it. But it's also that deconstruction was such a big idea. And maybe with social justice stuff now being talked about more, and identity being literally deconstructed in so many ways, maybe that language and those ideas are coming back. Maybe saying, okay, it's not just an ivory tower thing, but it actually has some application to stuff going on now. I don't know. I feel like I hardly ever hear people invoke Derrida. So.
No, it seems in poetry. There's some comments here. Derrida, because we are living in a
simulacrum.
I don't even know that word. I'm gonna have to look that up.
It's like the Matrix.
Oh, right. Okay, cool. Okay.
I don't know. Maybe. All right, we got a couple more questions from Geoffrey. Shaping a collection of poems always means choosing what should be in and what should be out. Is there a poem in the perseverance that you feel really altered the shape of the whole?
Oh, wow. A poem in the perseverance that altered the shape. I'm not sure. I was very much, when putting this book together, I very much was in the mind of I wanted it to work holistically. I wanted it to have a journey. So many of my favorite poetry collections, you read them that way, from first poem to last poem. They also work, in isolation, but you get a holistic kind of feel. So like that's what, when I'm talking about like the dimensions into ideas and all this kind of stuff, trying to honor I guess some of the intellectual, but also the emotional work of those different spaces. And also, like, I'm writing this as I'm quite freshly grief-stricken. So suddenly I'm mourning everything. Grief is just everywhere. And so, yeah, that's part of the shape. What's the question? Is there a poem in the perseverance that you feel really altered the shape of the work? I don't know. My hope is it worked as a whole, and it worked. Hence why there's so many kind of sequences in it as well. Part of that was thinking about the reader. I want them to keep engaged in this sense. Yeah.
I noticed, there are some of the poems that are from here. I was curious about the choices for those, what to leave in and what felt. I was sort of jealous. I was like, I would love, when I'm working on something new, I would love to be able to take a little chunk from another book where you're like, oh, now I know it really actually goes here, or it's still relevant to me. I wish I could do that.
No, this is part of the poetry tradition. We can do that. Walt Whitman did that his whole life. He wrote one book and just kept republishing the same book and just like revised. His whole career was just one book constantly being revised. So, I mean, we do that as poets, but also there's a thing of, in the shorter collection, because it doesn't get any kind of distribution. You only expect a very few readers from that. So that's also a thing. So Too Sweet and Bitter was a book I wrote pretty quickly, and just kind of let me just kind of have something that's there, and then I kind of, the way I think about To Sweet and Bitter as a kind of step onto a ladder to something, and then bringing in this whole other thing, because I don't think there's anything about kind of deafness or much about education. There's a bit in there, but I wanted to be more ambitious. So, I mean, and that's how I think I'm just going to keep evolving. So the book that's going to come up after The Perseverance, was out in September, that's got a whole other ambition in it. So it's kind of, pushing the form, pushing the conversation, and squeezing language in the air and on the page.
Exciting. Javier, do we have time for one more question?
I think our interpreter has to
Yes.
get moving soon, so we have to cut it off. I'm really sorry. That was fantastic. We could have gone for another hour. I mean, I have so many things to say to you, Raymond. I just really quick. There's a little bit of a story behind this event. I heard you read for a Tin House Zoom event a while back, and as Maryse knows, I've had a hard time. I've been selling books for 25 years as a bookseller, and I've had a hard time embracing poetry. And you talked about not reinventing the wheel, but as far as this reader is concerned, you did for me. I found my groove. Like I tore through your collection, and it's incredible. And we talked about you're a father. You're going to be a father. Your wife is pregnant, and just hearing you talk about your relationship with your father, you're going to knock it out of the park. Like it's going to come easy for you. So thank you so much for turning this for getting me to finally find my groove with poetry. And I'm gonna dig deeper, but thank you so much. Thank you. I want to thank Raymond and Maryse for being here tonight. What a great conversation and great questions. And Maryse, you really, as always, come prepared. Thank to McClindon and Bree Jones for splitting the ASL duties tonight. And for Becky Kramer and the rest of the good folks at Tin House for helping to make this happen. One last thing, you can still go, write this down, or exileonbookbill.com, purchase copies of Raymond's book and Maryse's books. It's never too early to shop for the holidays, and they will come with signed book plates. So thank everyone for coming out tonight, and have a good night.
Oh, thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry, I never do this. They're right here. I have them both. And there's the signed book plate. Beautiful. So thank you. Thank you, Raymond. Thanks, Maryse.
Thank you.
Hang out after we stop recording, if you guys can hang out after. Thank you. And anyone who wants to hang out afterwards, but Mac's got to go. Thank you, Mac.
Thank you, Bree.
Of course. Oh, did I go? Perfect. All right, y'all have a good one.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you.